Desperate to flee the civil war at home, Syrian refugees in ever greater numbers are risking the perilous journey from North Africa to the Italian island of Lampedusa. So far this month, 2 boats making the trip capsized, claiming more than 500 lives. But as Alan Pizzi reports, the troubles don't end for the refugees who do make it to land.
In an interview with Duncan De La Field from Atlanta's International Rescue Committee, Field says, refugees are created through persecution. The legal definition of a refugee is someone who has been forced to flee their home country and is unwilling or unable to return due to persecution or a well-founded fear of persecution. The UN recognizes 5 categories of persecution: race, religion, nationality, social group, or political opinion. Therefore, the ideal situation would be one in which these persecutions do not exist. The United Nations came together in 1951 and drafted the Convention relating to the status of refugees, outlining the legal mandate of the United Nations High Commission on Human Rights and the rights and the responsibilities of refugees. The convention was signed and ratified by 145 nations, including all of Europe. The document enumerates the rights entitled to the refugees by the host nation: non-discrimination based on race, gender, or religion, shelter, food, water, freedom of religion and religious education, and access to courts. Refugees must then abide by their host nation's customs, laws, and regulations, as well as waiting up to 3 years before entering the labor market. A person is deemed to be a refugee after they are approved by a host nation through an application process, and are then awarded the aforementioned rights. Those waiting to get approved are called political asylum seekers, and they are not considered to possess any rights from the host nation until they are proved to be a refugee. Therefore, many political asylum seekers arrive in the European Union to infested living conditions and lack of sustenance. In 2003, the European Union attempted to improve its asylum-seeking process by adopting a series of measures called the Common European Asylum System. It was a futile effort to coordinate criteria, procedures, and legalities of the asylum-seeking process among all of the EU nations. A few main policies that have exacerbated the abuse of political asylum seekers originated from this system. First, the system's mandates are actually just loose directives, unable to be enforced by the European Union's Parliament. Second, a political asylum seeker must apply for asylum in the first European nation they arrive in, thus placing most of the responsibilities on border nations like Greece and Italy. If a refugee attempts to apply for asylum in another nation, they are then detained and shipped like chattel back to the original European nation.
Farshad fled Afghanistan in 2008 after his life was endangered after an attempted murder by the Taliban after working as an interpreter with coalition forces. After being smuggled across the Middle East, he arrived in Greece. The Greek authorities detained Farshad for 7 days and released him with an order to leave the country. Without any identity papers, Farshad traveled to Belgium and applied for asylum. After a series of appeals, the Belgian authorities shipped Farshad back to Greece. Once he arrived, authorities placed Farshad in a small space with 20 other detainees with very limited access to restrooms. For 3 days, Farshad was given very little food, water, and fresh air along with a dirty mattress. Once released, he lived in a park without any means of sustenance while his paperwork was being processed. Farshad, after waiting 2 months in a city park, attempted to leave Greece, but was arrested and detained in the same horrible living conditions for over a week. Farshad, while waiting for a verdict on his status as a refugee, endured horrible living conditions and unnecessary detention.
The grief is still raw. Some relatives of those who died have flown here, clutching photos to prove the identity of their brothers, sisters, children. A week on, they're still being told the bodies cannot yet be released for burial. We were given rare access inside Lampedusa's refugee centre. It has room for 250. Many more have crowded in this week. They overflow outside and sleep in the dirt. There are people from Eritrea, Somalia, and those like Saba and her 4 children who didn't want to be identified, fleeing the war in Syria. They paid £3,000 to cross the sea.
It was like a death trip, a suicide trip. I don't recommend it to anyone. We were dying in Syria, and we faced death coming here too. It was only God who helped us make it through.
Divers have now recovered 319 bodies from last week's wreck. On the dockside nearby, the boats that migrants used for the crossings pile up.
Just imagine how desperate you would have to be in order to board one of these death traps and risk your life looking for a better future. And it's not just Syrians coming across on these boats. This year alone, tens of thousands have made this horrendous voyage. While war and poverty continue to fuel this mass migration, there's nothing Europe's politicians can do to stop them coming.
Recent events have made all of these problems infinitely worse. The normal refugee flow has been substantially increased due to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as instability in Libya and Syria. These problems have been brought to light, especially due to the sinking of a boat off the Sicilian island of Lampedusa. Over 300 people died when the boat carrying refugees from Africa capsized. Italian rescue crews refused to bring many survivors to shore, as they did not want to further stretch their limited resources. European countries are attempting to shut off their borders to prevent crises such as these from occurring by discouraging refugees from seeking out their countries in the first place. A failure of policy cooperation and sufficient protections for refugees are making the crisis worse and worse by the day.
However, there are solutions to these problems. As of now, there ceases to be a consistent system that protects the rights of refugees and asylum seekers throughout the international realm. Policy varies from country to country, and despite all attempts at creating a unified and succinct asylum system, implementation and development has failed. As the previously stated statistics demonstrate, this is an issue that desperately needs attention as it is linked to life and death. Our team hopes to spur advocacy internationally while creating a consistent policy initiative that clearly defines the political rights of refugees and is ratified by all countries. Success is rooted in deep political support as well as monetary support. Multilateralism must breed an environment of cooperation amongst countries. Gil Lochner is a visiting professor at the Refugee Center of the University of Oxford. He says, "The global refugee problem is not a humanitarian problem requiring charity, but a political problem requiring political solutions."
As the situation currently exists, few non-governmental organizations are overseeing the problem. Due to the nature of state sovereignty, NGOs do not question the actions of governments. Essentially, there is no watchdog to keep these governments accountable. It is our team's mission to engage the interest of NGOs and thereby motivate them to action.
In an interview with Duncan De La Field, a coordinator from Atlanta's International Rescue Committee, Field said, "Watchdog and NGOs can either bring carrot or stick attention to those involved in situations of persecution, or they can provide relief and support to those affected. In the first case, they can raise awareness about governments, parties, or other groups that cause persecution or help alleviate it, and use this attention to affect the resources or influences of their targets. In the second, they can provide shelter, food, protection, and other services to meet the basic needs of victims of persecution or help them to escape their harmful situation. Both types of help are necessary, and many groups provide both."
Policy is the second tier of our team's plan to capitalize refugees' rights. It is essential that countries work together and develop a platform of consistency that safeguards the political rights of these refugees. It is our greatest hope that the political rights of the refugees and asylum seekers in the European area are safeguarded and human rights atrocities are eradicated worldwide.